DC.
Very good. Very good. So Leslie's talk is called This Really Happened, Turning Fact into Fiction. And I'm going to step away and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. And again, I'll ask you to come up to the microphone and speak into it. And I'll stand here to facilitate that as needed. So take it away, Leslie.
Yay, thank you, thank you. I'm so delighted to be with all of you this summer, even from this distance here in way off Virginia. And I'm really grateful to Sheila and Chatham for this really wonderful program. I've been having a great time in workshop, and I think you guys have a really wonderful community here. And so it's humbling and maybe a little scary to know that some of you have read my book, This Angel on My Chest, but because you have, I thought it would make sense to talk about some of the issues, specific issues I faced in writing and structuring this book, and the ways about how and why I decided to use my life experiences as a basis for my art, because I'm a fiction writer, so I don't have to do that if I don't want to. So first, a little bit of background. This Angel on My Chest won the 2015 Drew Hines Literature Prize and was published by the University of Pittsburgh Press. It's a collection of stories, and I call this a collection of unconventionally linked stories. And the reason I say unconventionally linked is that, as you noticed, if you've read the book, they are linked by circumstance, not as maybe more typical, the same characters reappear or there's a similar setting. So each of these 16 stories deals with the aftermath of the death of a young husband. And yes, I am literally saying that each story is about the exact same thing. And yes, that may be an outrageously peculiar premise for a book. Nevertheless, that is the book I seem to have to write. And it's also an unconventional book, I think, because the stories are told in several different forms, including a quiz, a list, an index, a YouTube video, a craft lecture on point of view that features 10 different points of view. And the stories are based on the actual death of my first husband. And I've blurred fact and fiction quite a bit, and am very quick to announce so, which means, as you can imagine, it's a very personal book. And the initial assignment I gave myself when I was writing about this time in my life, when I realized that I was going to be putting together this collection of stories, was that each story had to include one hard, true thing from my personal experience of grieving Rob's death. So an incident or an observation or an emotional truth. And it wasn't my intention that readers spend their energy worrying about what's, true and what really happened. But what I wanted to do was capture that resonance of the universal experience of loss and grief. And to me, that's really the paradox of grief, that it is both universal, because we will all lose someone someday if we haven't already. And yet grief is also utterly individual. And you know this, if you have lost someone, you probably feel as though your heartbreak is the worst and only pain in the world. And so I wouldn't typically sort of use my own work as a basis for a craft talk, but when one is talking about moving life material between fact and fiction, I'm not sure it's possible to use other work and extrapolate with 100% accuracy from biographical knowledge. So, perhaps we can assume that Tim O'Brien used his experiences from his service in the Vietnam War in the things they carried. But in the end, literally only he can tell us whether those assumptions are correct. So here, in this case, I actually am the authority able to speak with immense knowledge of my own literal intentions. And for the people who are writing poetry, and who may be using their lives or experience as source material, the general principles of what I'm saying are going to apply to your genre as well. And so just because I don't sort of say poetry, that doesn't mean I'm excluding you. I love poets. It just means that you may have to sort of mentally adapt my remarks here a little bit into the parameters of your practice. Okay, so first, why write fiction instead of memoir? If I know I'm writing about my life, why write fiction instead of memoir? Why blur the two as I have purposely done? And obviously, I can't say one genre is better than the other, and everyone is welcome to write whichever genre they choose, of course, obviously. But speaking for myself, I've always been primarily a fiction writer because I like to hide. I know my face is giant on a screen, and that sounds very terrifying because I like to hide. I'm from the Midwest, and while I'm not willing to say, here's a whole book about me, I can say, here's a book about other women whose husbands have died. So that's kind of a simple answer, but I wasn't content in my writing process. I wasn't content with those kind of surface reasons. And so remember, both genres are really powerful. And so I'll just offer a glimpse of my thought process as I pondered my questions more deeply. Why fiction and why not memoir? And so as a writer, remember, we always think about the audience and the reader. How can we keep the reader invested and keep them flipping those pages? And for me, being allowed to invent things was a powerful tool that I personally could not give up. So early on, I turned to fiction. And as I said, it's the genre I know best and am the most comfortable in. And one of the reasons I'm very comfortable on team fiction is that I like taking something half interesting that happened to me and then adding the elements needed to make the event actually fully interesting, sort of embellishing, raising the stakes, tossing in the unexpected, watching a character suddenly reveal a secret or tell a lie. And really, to be very basic, my own life just isn't that fascinating. It's so much better, I believe, for my reader if I use my personal experience as a jumping off point and then make things up to improve upon them when what actually happened to me was quite boring. And I'm not saying losing your husband at a young age is boring, but I am saying I'm not the only person to whom this has happened. And so just the facts of my story are not inherently interesting unless, you're my friend or family or someone who cares about me. So I also found myself thinking about the book and the story I wanted to tell. And so form and structure always follow function, I believe. And to arrive at an artful book, there needs to be a reason for every decision along the way. And if not an active decision, because, our subconscious is very important in our writing, there needs to be a justification. So why is this chapter here? What is this character's function? Why am I in this book repeating this same story over and over? Why is this book not a memoir? Why do I feel compelled to tell people how I'm blurring truth and fiction? And the answer came when I realized that I want the reader to be aware always that there is a living person who died. My husband died. And I don't want the reader to forget that. And so my goal wasn't simply to memorialize Rob, my husband. Rather, I wanted the fact of his real life existence to keep the reader just that little bit uncomfortable. I didn't want readers to feel easily able to distance themselves from this book and its reality, which is that people die, that my husband died, that we will all die, that you, reader, will die. We will all mourn and be mourned. And then additionally, I realized that I wanted my book to look and seem different on the page. I found that when I was in the midst of my most deep grieving, one of the most distressing things for me was the way the world looked perfectly normal, everyone going about their business, as I was wrestling with this immense pain. So I wanted my book to reflect that kind of mixed up, surreal experience of living in a world that doesn't feel right anymore. And this is also one of the reasons I realized I turned to alternate forms to tell my overall story. And so at this point in the writing process, so I've been writing all along and thinking, writing and thinking at the same time. And at this point, I felt validated in my decision. I could answer those questions. I understood why I was writing the book the way I was, why it was fiction, not memoir, and why I was blurring lines between fact and imagination. I felt happy that form was following function, and I proceeded with, I'll just say, confidence, as much confidence as any writer ever really feels. So then I started thinking more deeply about what it means to write about my own life, my own experiences, to put myself on the page so openly, so to speak, whether in fiction or poetry. Not that I have any skills writing poetry, don't worry, but or in creative fiction, nonfiction itself. You know, what does that mean to put your own life on the page? And I have written and published, you know, many personal essays, but I can admit to all of you that they're often kind of impersonal personal essays. There's only one or two that are really sharp and deep to the bone. And the life experiences that I draw on for my essays in general are often, I often choose topics that don't require me to go really deep to that deep to the bone revelation, those deep excavations. So this was a big switch for me. And so I want to move on to some principles that I found to be helpful to have in mind when making that move, even just a small one, into turning your own life experiences into fiction, or when you're writing in any situation where other real life people might recognize themselves in your work or might recognize you in your work. And sort of the first thing I figured out and understood was that I needed to be hardest on myself. So you need to be hardest on yourself. It really takes courage to show your own vulnerabilities and your own bad behavior and any complicity that you have to put all that on the page. It's really hard, but that is what you have to do. Otherwise, you're writing a work of revenge. Look at all these people and the terrible things they did to me. Or maybe you're writing sort of a victim piece. Look what happened to me. And naturally, this can be very tricky. Let's say your material is about surviving sexual abuse or rape, and I am certainly not implying that you should write in such a way as to make yourself seem at fault somehow for those horrible violations. But what I do mean is to look at yourself as kind of a character within your situation and look at yourself as that character with immense and difficult honesty. And doing so is going to establish a bond with the reader who will trust you immediately and who then will follow you through all the pages of your book or story. As a writer, you'll establish authority when you, or sort of the you of the story, is portrayed in all your messy complexity. Readers like to see that writers are writing from a place of wisdom and self-awareness, that they're not out to get their family members or get other people in the material. A writer who sees that they are flawed is also a writer who can see that the world is flawed, as is every person inhabiting it. So always be hardest on yourself. And in my case, to give you an example, there is this story, Index of Food, that comes towards the end, and it explores my guilt about being the one to survive. That story admits that I'm happy to be alive and to have continued living and to have gotten remarried. So you can imagine how it would feel reading that if you were Rob's mother, right? Because she would pick Rob to be alive. She would not pick me. You know, you just know that. And so that was a hard story to put out there, to say those things, but I did. And the same with the story about the woman who has torrid sex in the restaurant with her brother-in-law, which is called Slut. That was not so much an emotional hardest on myself situation, but an event in a story that I suppose people might think really happened. And I had to understand and accept that risk going into it. I had to make the me of the book look that way, not say Rob's mother being the one to have torrid sex in a restaurant bathroom. That could be an equally good and relevant story that, that I could write, but it just wasn't appropriate to me for this very personal book, for this personal experience being expressed in this way, where I knew I was purposely blurring fact and fiction. I personally could not do that to Rob's mother, to even let the reader think for a moment that maybe Rob's mother did that. Maybe she did, I don't know. But I had to put that burden on me. I had to be hardest on myself. One thing that helped me with this book, and one thing I suggest for you if you're writing about this kind of hard material, is to write your book or stories or essays or poetry in secret, as if family members or the people you're worried about won't read it. You can worry about them later. People will see themselves where they want to, and they'll ignore seeing themselves too, surprisingly. I was at AWP, the big writing conference once, and heard a writer, a creative nonfiction writer, say something that just seemed so fascinating to me and insightful, that people don't mind if you reveal something they already know about themselves. It's when you reveal something they didn't know that they get riled. So for example, I consider myself kind of a bossy person. If somebody writes about me and calls me bossy, I get that. But if somebody writes about me and shows something that I think I've hidden or that's secret to the world and they see that, that's when it's very startling to be written about. And that's why sometimes writing in secret and just getting the words down for yourself is the most important thing, because anything can happen later down the line. You might think you have the book in your head, but it is going to change and shift, and you have no idea what will be left standing in the end. Maybe that part that you're so worried about will be edited out. Maybe someone will die. I mean, not that we want that to happen, but it is possible. Maybe you and your friend will have a falling out over something else, and she won't be in your life by the time you're finished. Often I hear people say things like, oh, I have to wait till my father dies before I can write that story. And I say, no, what you have to do right now is write that story as if he is dead and then worry about it later. And yes, I know there are lots of stories about families being unhappy with books that have come out. And sometimes those families mend and sometimes they don't. Sometimes the family becomes stronger. Sometimes the family is destroyed, but the author feels comfortable in that decision that they have made to expose lies and or secrets. And sometimes, often, people react differently than we assume they will. Helen Fremont, who's written two really powerful memoirs about her life, the second memoir about the experience of how her family dealt with the first memoir, also was speaking at AWP this last spring and said about her experience, she said, the people who loved me still loved me after they read my book. The people who turned on me never really loved me in the first place. And that is a hard thing to realize. And also it can be a really liberating thing to realize. And so in the end, you cannot control anyone's reaction. So in this, the purest part of the creative process, don't worry about those reactions. I know, yes, later, you may need to consider those ramifications later. I get that. But now, don't. Now you can just write your book and not show it to anyone until you're ready. You really can. You can just write. Don't let fear stifle your voice, which leads me to, I've heard this word come up a number of times already, which is to be brave. Tell the story you most need to tell. Tell that story you're afraid to tell. And this really is where I believe the strongest material comes from, this sort of dark place we all have within us, where all our secrets and fears and humiliation and truths reside, the dark place, the hidden place, the lockbox of secrets, the shadows, that place, whatever metaphor works for you. I tend to use the dark place as a fairly common image in talking about writing. I took it from Margaret Atwood's book about writing called Negotiating with the Dead. And to illustrate her point about what this dark place means, she used the myth of Orpheus, who is the beautiful musician who played the lyre so wonderfully that supposedly no one could resist him, not even the gods. And so Orpheus fell in love with Eurydice, but on the wedding day, there's several sort of versions. This is the version I looked up. On their wedding day, right after being married, she walked in a meadow with her bridesmaids and she was bitten by a viper and fell dead, which is really just such bad luck. And Orpheus was distraught and couldn't overcome his immense loss. So he decided to do what no man had done before, which was to descend into the underworld, to Hades, the place of death, and play his music to persuade the rulers of the underworld, Hades and Persephone, to let Eurydice come back. So he made this perilous journey, he played his music, it all worked, and they said, yes, Eurydice can return under one condition, that Orpheus not look back at her as they made their way up to the world. And they were almost out, or in some versions, he actually had stepped out and he thought she was right there, but he looked back to see if she was with him, and then she was lost to him forever. There were no second chances. And it's sort of funny, I always kind of remembered the myth before looking it up, was that she was the one who looked back, and that she sort of, it was her kind of fault. But no, he did. It was the storyteller looked back. And so while he made it out of the underworld, and he had an amazing story to tell. I was in the underworld. You'll never guess what's down there. There was this immense sacrifice involved. I mean, that makes the story even darker, that he got the story, but he had to sacrifice something to get that story. And so to me, that is really a dark way of thinking about the writing life, and also kind of a really profound way of thinking about the writing life. It's not going to be easy to write what needs to be written. So if Orpheus didn't look back, he'd still have a story and we'd be interested. But the fact that he has this sacrifice, that they don't live happily ever after, just makes the story more powerful. And then the other thing that we have to remember when we're writing about emotional material is if he didn't make it back, there would be no story at all. So you have to navigate going down to that place where those secrets are, because you have to be able to get yourself back. And sometimes people aren't ready for that, and that is okay. The time will be right when you are ready. And so we all have that kind of dark place, that material, whether we admit to it or not, whether we go poke around in there or not. And saying all this doesn't mean you need to go, this afternoon and immediately dredge up a lot of immense pain and lose your loved one like Orpheus. There are all kinds of books and stories and all kinds of ways of writing. There's lots of ways to write a book. But I do suspect, speaking for myself, I suspect that the books that we are now reading from 100, 200, whatever years ago, and the ones that will be people in the future will still be reading, I think for the most part, those are the books that come from that place. Like if you look at fairy tales, their message of don't go into the woods alone or you'll be eaten by a witch, or even just this Orpheus myth itself, thousands of years old, still known to us, still an incredibly powerful story because it's so dark. And as I noted previously, ask yourself, why must the audience see this book as true? Why actually is memoir the only way to share this story? Do you need your audience to know that it's true, or not. And I kind of went through this in reverse, wondering why it was that I thought I had to go around and tell everyone that these stories, these made up things, were based on the truth. I definitely just could have taken the truth that resonates and simply gone about my business, calling it a collection of short stories, but I wanted the reader to feel unsettled. So I suggest you think about the relationship between yourself and the truth. There are almost always autobiographical elements to fiction. So how comfortable are you admitting that? Because I promise you, someone in every single audience you will ever face will ask, did that really happen? If it's fiction, people want to know, but you do not have to tell them. You don't have to tell them if it's true or not. I remember witnessing one of my very best writer friends, someone I know so well, lie directly, saying that he made up something to a response to an audience question. And someone said, "Oh, did that really happen?" And what was funny is when he said, "No, I made it up," I was like, I don't believe that. You know, it just felt like something that probably was real. I knew this guy well, and it sounded very true. And so later, after, over drinks, I asked him again, and he admitted that he had lied, that the core of the story, which was a really violent, dangerous incident, had really happened to a friend of his. And this friend is the most trustworthy person I know. I had never heard him lie ever about anything. So I was really kind of rattled and shocked. But he said, "I don't owe that lady in the audience anything." And that is true. He was right. A good story is enough. It doesn't matter if it's true in the end or isn't. You know, do we have to know if Romeo and Juliet were actually two people, or do we just need to believe that they feel real to us? So this is to say there's no right or wrong answer. But if you are moving around in fiction and autobiography, or like my friend, like all of us probably, stealing source material from real people, which is fine, that you might want to start thinking about your relationship to the material, how you feel about revealing what is true and what isn't true, and why. And my last general observation before moving on to some nuts and bolts thoughts, my last general observation is that throughout this whole writing process, I constantly wrestled with the so what principle. Just because something happened to me, so what? Memoir is meaningless if it can't move beyond, hey, here's a bunch of crap that happened to me one time. That writing can be meaningful to you or to your family, and there are all kinds of ways to write and different purposes. And maybe someone just wants to write the story of their life or their family to enjoy. And maybe the private practice of journal writing brings peace and personal insight. Those are all great and noble reasons to write. But I am a professional writer, and I'm always aware of an audience. And an outside audience is always wanting to find the so what of the writing. And I was reminded of one of the masters of memoir, Vivian Gornick, who writes in her classic craft book, The Situation in This Story, what happened to the writer is not what happened. Let's start over. What happened to the writer is not what matters. What matters is the large sense that the writer is able to make of what happened. For that, the power of a writing imagination is required. As V.S. Pritchett once said of the genre, it's all in the art. You get no credit for living. So you have to take these experiences and create something from them. It's not enough to have just lived them. And so Vivian Gornick was speaking specifically of memoir, but obviously fiction also needs to be responsive to these concerns and become more than just a recitation of events, especially what's called literary fiction. It's my sense that the general public sort of understands this already, that a novel is shaped because they all went to some English class where they had to learn about the symbolism of the green light and stuff. And I think that makes beginning writers more fearful maybe of just diving into a novel, saying, I'm going to write about my life in a novel. It's like, I'm going to write about my life in a novel, but what are the symbols? So they feel a little more leery. Whereas someone might be more prone to just think they can write their life story in memoir, you know, and sell it and make $1 million. which does happen, but not always. And also, I just do have to note, just to make sure we all know, there are perfectly wonderful types of fiction that by definition actually don't have to make that leap of so what, and are just purely entertaining to read. You know, romances, spy thrillers, mysteries, all those kinds of books. So there, as a fiction writer, there is a place where the story can be enough. But unless you're a celebrity, it's likely that your life story is going to need something extra, that extra resonance, where your work is going to have to answer that so what question, where your personal experience is going to have to move into the universal in some very profound way. And I knew that for me, my book was not going to be self-therapy. My book was not catharsis. And a lot of people think that that's why I wrote the book, but I wrote a book because I wanted to write a book, an artful shaped work. I wanted to get it published. I wanted to write a book that would help my career. I thought about all those things. I wanted to write a book for an audience. So how do you do that when you're thinking about using your own life and making an audience interested in your own life? And so we've been talking about some of those big picture things that were helping me to get into that space of shifting my life into an artful book. But what about the nuts and bolts? So how can we right now get busy with our writing and apply these larger principles? How exactly might one approach writing fiction with this hard material from our own lives? And I'm going to talk about a few strategies that evolved from my writing process. And so when approaching autobiographical material, I think that having some distance is essential, emotional distance and also literal time. Probably it might even mean years. There's one story in my book that I wrote right after Rob died. It was actually the first thing I wrote after he died, period. And that is the first story, 10 Things. And I like that it's there because it feels really immediate, feels a little different to me than the other stories in the book because I wrote that in the midst of my grieving. Then I didn't write about Rob hardly at all for 14 years. So a lot of time passed since my husband died. And often as I was working on the stories in This Angel on My Chest, the life I was describing didn't feel like my own life exactly. My work, even though very personal, often seemed as if I were writing fiction because so much time had passed. And I found myself thinking about working on a book rather than working on my life story. And that's not to say there weren't times, many times, where the material felt fraught and made me cry and stirred up hard feelings, just that at those times thinking book instead of life was helpful. And having all that distance between myself and the experience was definitely helpful. And I'm not saying 14 years is some magical, that's the exact moment. You'll know what that moment is when you're ready. And for me, it happened to be 14 years later in an unexpected way. Another thing that helped me find that kind of distance was form. Remember, I told you my book has all these different stories. There's a list, a craft lecture. I used the second person. I used many different strategies. And I was saying in the workshop yesterday that that's how I tackled the most personal stories. That was the way for me to tap into the harder emotional material by kind of giving myself sort of that distance maybe of the second person by assigning myself a list or an index. And also remember, in my case, I'm talking about a book in which there are 16 stories and in each a young husband dies. The truth is I literally had to do something different to make sure the reader didn't get bored. So again, I'm thinking about the reader. And then humor can definitely help you handle difficult emotional material. In a quiz, I write in the form of a quiz and offer multiple choice answers to a variety of situations the young widow faces. And I use humor, hopefully humor, to deflect the pain until the very ending, which I find very painful. And once I remember speaking at a university, and in the Q&A, a young man who had been assigned to read the story for a class, got to the mic and said, there I was reading and laughing. And then all of a sudden I wasn't. Like, you did that on purpose, like pulling the rug out from me. And I felt uncomfortable. I said, exactly, with a smile. And then in my head, I thought, would you have kept reading if it wasn't funny? And that doesn't mean you or your work has to be, like this big laugh riot, but look for moments to lighten up through humor if you can, or for moments of self-deprecation. Another technique that was very helpful for me as a fiction writer was adding imaginary characters that I needed. So the circle is set in a young widow support group is very similar to one I attended, like the exact same church basement, many details very similar. But I had to think about what's in the tension. They all meet and eventually they start to feel better. That was great in real life, but that's not very interesting to read about. So I added Ruth, the therapist who runs the group. She was totally invented. I mean, somebody ran our group, but Ruth was invented, and I gave her a big problem. And that problem is that here she is helping people heal themselves, and she's avoiding the doctors and the friend who want her to face the fact that she has breast cancer and that indeed she may be dying. The women in the group don't know any of this, but the reader knows. And so I went to this support group and I met some friends who were very similar to the two who emerge in the story. And there was a woman who led the group, but I have not one single memory of what that woman leading the group looked like. And I certainly have no idea about her personal life at all. You can also add an event for drama. So I told you I wrote 10 things as a short story. And then in this very strange turn, and one of those moments where you never say no to someone who says, oh, hey, can you write this in nonfiction so you can be published in the Washington Post magazine? Yes, I can. I rewrote that story as nonfiction. And the fictional version of 10 things is maybe 80% true. So I knew that there was a big basis of truth because you can't lie in the Washington Post. You can't invent characters. So I knew I could take an 80% true short story and turn it into an essay. And people from that story, people love tiny details, like how my husband once described me as an avocado, but that didn't happen after a dog died. And in that story, it ends with the narrator kissing the husband's best friend. And I knew in a list of 10 things, you have to end with something really big. So I made up that ending. I added that event for drama to create that buildup. I invented to make the story better. And so when I was doing the nonfiction version, obviously that's what I took out. And then I had to reveal something else very personal that could equal that drama. And then when you're thinking about your own life, our own lives are filled with a lot of detail, and you want to make sure and remove the dull and irrelevant details. So my story, Someone in Nebraska, is actually a very true story set in a very true bar that I spent time in during a residency. But I didn't have to talk about the other barflies. I didn't have to describe the town I was in because in the story, I wanted to give the impression of someone passing through. I didn't talk about how nervous I was to go to this bar in this little town. I didn't talk about how I liked the cheeseburgers on the menu. I didn't exactly reflect the rambling way the bartender, Dallas, told the story that took much longer to hear in the bar than the 8 minutes it takes for me to read that entire story out loud. And because that was a real bartender who I became friends with and liked, I gave her a fake name, but I gave her a name that I knew she would appreciate. And I decided I needed to tell her that I wrote that story since basically I was stealing her life and I cared about her. And I had to apologize to her that in the story, I needed to call her not pretty because she was pretty. She was very pretty. And so I did choose to tell her that I wrote this story. And that was actually a very meaningful experience for me. And it seemed for her. But you don't have to. You can write in secret. You can publish in secret. as long as you do understand, it is possible that someone may find out. I've heard really interesting stories about somebody who wrote about their terrible stepfather, and it was published in like the Southwest Review, and the stepfather's neighbor was 3 years later in an Airbnb in Vermont, and there was that copy of the Southwest Review and read it. I mean, that was a literal story somebody told, which kind of chilled me to the bone. So it's likely that people won't find out, but just remember, it is always possible that they could. And then also, even in the bigger sense, remember that you can remove anything you want in the fiction and in the nonfiction. There are plenty of things, trust me, that were hard and true about losing Rob that I just wasn't going to write about. I would never write about them. I had my reasons, which are irrelevant because I don't want to, can be its own reason, as long as the story doesn't need that element. And I think it might be easier to eliminate things in the fictional version of your life. You can make up stuff to fill the gaps you don't want to write about. You can condense or allude. And when someone in the know says, that's not how it happened, you just say fiction. And of course, you know, here we go back to what I was saying earlier about thinking about your relationship to the truth. Does your story need that stuff you're cutting out? I decided my book didn't, but if it did, I would have included it because my loyalty is to my book. Because what you don't want to do is cut things out that the book needs, that the story needs. You don't want to shy away from the material just because you're afraid, just because it's hard. It needs to be a purposeful decision, and in my mind, made in service of the art. And as for eliminating, you know, facts in nonfiction, in the memoir, again, you know, going in, you can't include everything. But here, if there is something of relevance, even if it is hard, it seems like you are going to have to include it. And I remember working with a beginning writer who was working on a memoir about a difficult time in her family's life. And she was sort of new to writing. She wanted to write this life story. And I was reading early chapters and I knew there was something more to her story, but, you know, I didn't push her. And then eventually she confessed that her marriage had almost ended. And I sort of waited, you know, reading more work. And then several months later, different workshop, she came and told me that she had in fact cheated on her husband. And now she knew that the story, her memoir, needed that information, though it was going to be really hurtful to dredge up those events. She started out thinking, I can get away writing this story without giving this information. But as she was working, as she was learning how to be a writer, she understood that she needed to provide that information. And I was so proud of her at that moment. She was making the choice, you know, a real writer would make. And her memoir would have been false without that. On the other hand, here's something I heard Cheryl Strayed, author of Wild, say during a talk, and this was shocking to me, and I still kind of wrestle with what this means. If you've read Wild, it's about her journey hiking alone on the, I think called the Pacific Crest Trail, up the spine of California to the northwest. And as she was doing that, she was dealing with the grief of losing her mother. And she told this whole huge audience that her brother met her on the trail and hiked with her for a couple of days. It was maybe even a week. He was on heroin then, and she didn't feel that his story was part of her story for the book she was writing, for the story she wanted to shape. So she left that out. I mean, to me, that seems like a big thing to leave out, but to her, it was the right decision. And it's hard, you know, I can't say if she should have included it or not. She was certain her book didn't need it. So again, you know, all this goes to the deep thinking that you'll need to do as you examine your material and think about the thing you're writing. You don't have to include it all, and you literally cannot include it all. So why are you choosing to include what you do include? A strategy that was helpful for me as I was going through this process was I kind of wrote about the writing. I mean, I did it actually in my book in Index of Food, which is an exploration of my guilt about also writing a book, like trying to get published writing about this terrible thing that happened to me, that happened to my husband. I mean, that made me feel guilty and weird. So I wrote about it in the writing, but you also could keep a writing journal as you push through the difficult material, especially if it's a long project. So think, how does it feel to write about this material? How does it feel digging so close to the bone? How are you finding yourself thinking differently about family members? What challenges have you had? What triumphs? The revelations along the way may find their way into the material directly, or they may feed the project indirectly, kind of deepening your thinking about this time in your life. And another reminder, having the veil will make you feel braver. If you've been struggling with a story you feel you must tell, but you're worried about your family or whoever, imagine if you could tell that story and they wouldn't see themselves. That literally is what fiction can be. So I told you early on, I didn't write overtly about Rob or my grieving until I wrote This Angel on My Chest. But my second novel, it's called A Year and a Day. It was the novel I wrote after Rob died. That book is set in 1975. It's set in Iowa. It's about a 15-year-old girl whose mother has committed suicide and the year after that tragedy. So really, it's a book all about grieving and loss as Alice struggles to cope with what has happened. In my mind, that was the book I wrote about Rob. That's the book I wrote about all the things I went through. But it's set in Iowa in 1975 about a 15-year-old girl and a dead mother. Not one thing on paper looks like my life with Rob, but to me, it's the book I wrote about Rob, that it's fiction. And then finally, I want to address again that urgency of being brave. And while this statement means be brave in tackling difficult and dark material, it also means be brave in your pursuit. Follow your instincts, even as they lead you down a ludicrous path of writing 16 stories about dead husbands, stories that are both and not true, or a 40-page story careening around in 10 points of view. Follow your instincts. In the end, the only unbreakable rule is to be interesting and to tell a good story, a story that reaches deep into your reader's heart. You can't pass something off invented as fact, not yet, not entirely, or supposedly, but you can and should simply tell your story and let the genre labels figure themselves out. Why worry about the sort of detail like what they will call it on the bookstore shelf when you are the writer, you're the teller of the story? Deep in the bowels of the literary world, we know there are all kinds of writers experimenting and blurring fact and fiction and creating hybrid genres, doing all kinds of things. Don't be afraid to join them. A couple names, David Shields, John DeGata, are two nonfiction people. Carl Ave Nosgard, with his 6 volumes of his life called My Struggle, would be on the fictional side. Sheila Heti. There's just lots of other people doing all kinds of interesting things. And we are, all of us, artists and adventurers. We wouldn't turn to writing if we weren't. And so really all we have to do is use words. There are no other rules. Use words, be interesting, tell your story first. First, tell your story. Thank you. I guess we have time for questions.
Leslie, thank you. I'm going to turn the camera around. So hopefully this will work. Maybe not. Wait a minute. Help me, Joe. Okay.
It was like a strobe light.
There we go. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we'll proceed the way we've been. If you have a question for Leslie, we'll start in the room and then I'll go to the chat. Does anybody would like to come up and ask a question? Come on up, Karen. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Here she comes.
Ooh. Hi, my name is Karen, and I'm a nonfiction writer, and I'm also an addict in recovery.
Mm.
So my work of memoir is very much focused on sort of breaking through the anonymity that is, the bedrock of the recovery community, especially because I want to tell stories that, while deeply steeped in trauma, are still startling in a joyful way.
Mhm.
And so I am just, yes, I would love to not think about those things, but for someone who has a lot of anxiety and would like to know what are some things that are external factors that might affect a book being categorized as fiction versus nonfiction, I guess just what are the things that authors don't have a say in? And I'm thinking specifically of James Fry, A Million Little Pieces.
Right. Well, I think everybody learned some lessons from James Fry. So hopefully. Oh, wait, I have to get back to gallery view. I wanted to see you, so you were on my screen, and then suddenly my face showed up on my own screen. So that was bad. Okay. Well, I think that sort of this deep thinking process that I went through was helpful to me, so that I was very confident. I knew what my book was. I knew how I wanted it to be positioned. And actually, that story I referred to a quiz. I wanted to get a lot of stories published before the book or whatever along the way. I sent that to a literary journal, to the since I just barely said Indiana Review, a very nice, respectable, excellent university literary journal. I sent it, here's my fiction. And they said, we like this, but we want to publish it as an essay. And I'm like, but it's not exactly true. It's true, but it's not true. These literal things didn't happen. And because I felt very confident in myself, even though I wanted to be published in the Indiana Review, I said, no, I made this up. This is not an essay. And why are you switching it? I mean, I didn't say that to them, but I thought it in my head. I thought that was strange. And so sort of doing that sort of deep along the way to understand who you are and what your book is and should be, I think helps you in those situations. It is crazy, like James Fry. I can see why it was very tempting. There was a lot of money. I believe that may have been his first book. Maybe I'm wrong. It's easy when some big gatekeeper in New York tells you what you should do, but it is your book and you have to stand by it. And sometimes that means saying no. I hope that's helpful. I wish there was like a more specific answer, but to just sort of know yourself, know your book. Don't be afraid to say no. Because somebody else will find it. Although I do have to say, nobody else published that story, a quiz, so it did remain unpublished, but it's in the book, and that's the important thing.
Thank you.
Good luck with your writing. Sounds
Thanks,
like a
Karen.
great project.
Okay, I'm going to go to the chat because I think I saw something from Mary. How do you deal with the consequences for certain stories? I'm worried about the shock of my audience, my family, and their reactions.
Yeah, it's a personal, I mean, I can't speak directly to your family, but it is definitely something to reckon with. I've had a couple experiences where I had an essay that was fairly personal about my husband published in the Sun magazine, which is one of my favorite magazines. And the editor said, we're not publishing this until you share it with your mother-in-law. That's who it was about. It's kind of about our fight for the memory of Rob. And I was terrified. I shared it, and it ended up being a very good experience. And I was shocked. And he said, the editor said, oh yeah, we find that in 98% of the time that for most people, it ends up working out. Now, that's great, unless you're in the 2%. And one of the things that was helpful about this book, so I'm married now, so I have a new husband, and he's very supportive of my writing and my past life, all things. But early on, I remember saying to him, I'm writing these stories. I'm really excited about this book. Do you want to read some? And he's like, no. I'm like, you should read. They're really good. He's like, no. I was like, why don't you want to read my stories? He's like, I'm not probably ever going to read those stories. I don't want to read those stories about you and Rob. And then, my face was like, what am I doing? I have these stories. Do I have to get rid of this? And then the greatest gift he ever gave me was he said, but I want you to keep writing them. And so it's true, he doesn't, he's never read this book cover to cover. And that was a great gift. So I think you can't know what will happen. I think you might think about when is the time to talk about it with your family. And sometimes that time is pretty far along in the process. It's very hard to argue with a book contract, like, oh, look, they're publishing the book or a finished book. But depending on your family, maybe earlier is better. But I do believe that you should just write first and keep going, and then find that time when you're ready to deal with the family. And fingers crossed for you. It's hard to be related to a writer. And I've had some things written about me that made me uncomfortable by other writer friends. Long story, but it's hard to be written about. I'm very respectful of writers' families who have to put up with us.
Thank you. You, Harina, come on up.
How much truth can you put in a story and still call it fiction?
You can put all the truth, all of it. It can all be 100% true, and you can call it fiction. That's the easy equation. Yeah, nobody needs to know anything that happened. That's why I found it so curious that that I felt like I had to tell people this stuff was true. Lots of things I write are true. They're short stories, and I don't tell them, but I just wanted everyone to know that. But you definitely can write word for word anything true that happened to you and call it a short story. So yay, go forth, do it.
So if you go the other route, what is the minimum truth you can put in and call it nonfiction?
That one, I think, is kind of a sliding scale depending on the writer you are. I know that some creative nonfiction writers are comfortable sort of, I don't know, describing the dress they were wearing as a dress that they owned that they might have worn. Some are comfortable making up a dress entirely. Some would say, I don't remember what dress I was wearing, so I'm going to omit that. I would feel that it seems to me it's getting a little more towards the side of making things up, which makes me personally a little uncomfortable and makes me personally a little not leery of memoir and nonfiction, because I love that genre and I love reading it, but making me feel like this stuff is probably more fictionalized than I imagine. But that's my personal view. I think that's something all creative nonfiction writers kind of wrestle with. And there's no exact formula. And I would guess that in general, the big events had better be true. Like we were referred to James Fry, and he said that he was in jail, and he really sort of was, I believe, maybe just hauled to the police station for an hour or two. So that's like a lie that doesn't work, is, so that kind of thing, don't say that your mother abused you, because that's dramatic. I mean, that would be a bad thing to lie about. But, what you were wearing on the day you made the phone call to your friend, that probably doesn't matter. I think everybody wrestles with that in the nonfiction world, creative nonfiction world.
Thanks.
That's okay. Okay, we're going to go to the chat. And the question's from Caroline. In the story In a Dream in your collection, the point of view is second person with the narrator addressing her deceased husband as you. How did you decide that you wanted the reader to have the husband's perspective?
sure I understand. How did I decide I wanted the reader to have the husbands? Let me look at that story. You know what? I love that story. Nobody ever talks about it. That's also one that irked me that I couldn't get published. Oh, okay, yes. Because I did feel like the sort of the truth of that story was really wrestling with this vision of getting remarried and what that means. And sort of many married couples kind of make that sort of promise, oh, I'd never be married. Oh, if I die, I want you to get remarried. And everything changes when the reality of the relationship changes. And so is that a real promise or not? So I would say that this is the story that I really felt like I most was writing to Rob. I don't think I'm answering your question, but we will follow up in workshop when I think about it a little bit more.
Great. Anybody else in the room? Come on up, Ketty.
Hello, my name's Hetty and I'm a fiction writer. So I have a question about if there's anything legal to worry about when you put truth in your fiction. Like if you're writing about a real company and you're fictionalizing it or something like that, or are you just totally protected by the label fiction?
Well, I would say in theory, if you're not doing song lyrics, you are protected by the label fiction. But I also would confess that there probably are certain giant, large companies that have giant legal teams that I probably wouldn't say bad things about even in fiction. I just probably wouldn't. And what I kind of enjoy doing is writing so that the reader knows exactly what company I'm talking about in this example without naming them. Like my story, One True Thing, anyone who has been to Bread Loaf or probably even looked at the website would recognize that I'm totally writing about Bread Loaf, which I totally am. But I just chose not to say Bread Loaf because maybe they'll invite me to teach there someday. I didn't want to make anybody angry. And then also what is helpful to me is in fiction, then I could sort of deviate a little bit so that the reader can't say, well, that doesn't really happen that way at Bread Loaf. So I can sort of do what I want. I will say I probably personally wouldn't say anything too bad about an actual company using an actual company's name. But if I wanted to, I definitely would indicate to the reader that's who this company is, but it's fiction and you can't sue me because I didn't name you exactly.
Yeah,
sounds like you have an interesting story to tell though about a company.
I don't know, like a business or a company.
Right.
I don't know. But thank you. Yeah, I don't want to get sued. Thank you.
Yeah, no writer does, because everybody has more money and more lawyers than the writer does.
That's very true. Okay, we're going to have one more question, and it's going to come from Valerie in the chat. It seems like having an explanation for everything. It seems like having an explanation for everything in your stories is important to you. What is the role of the unconscious in your writing process?
Oh, yes. I'm glad you asked that question so I can clarify, because I just kind of dropped in. I totally believe in the subconscious, unconscious, and the conscious. And so lots of things do just show up in my writing and I just follow them and do that. But later in revising is where I try and understand, why is that there? Just because something showed up doesn't justify its existence in my mind. But yeah, definitely connections are made, or it's like, why is this story veering this way? Why am I in the second person? So in the writing, in the drafting, I just go with it and see what happens. But in revising, that's when I think, why is it this way? Is there something else I can do to enhance it or amplify? Maybe it shouldn't be here. And then even saying that, like, there are plenty of subconscious, unconscious things that show up. It's always amazing when someone has read one of my stories or my book. I go to a book club and people notice all these connections. I'm like, oh yes, that was totally intentional. It's like, I had no idea that was in there. And that to me is the joy and mystery and excitement about writing. So yes, 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 I believe in the unconscious and subconscious.
A great place to end. Leslie, thank you so much for your
Thank
wisdom and sharing
you.
with us. And we're clapping for you.
Thank
Probably
you.
can't see us, but we're clapping. And we'll be back this evening to hear you read. We're really excited. So
Awesome.
enjoy the rest of your day, Zoomers. Thanks again, Leslie. We'll see you later.
Thank you. Bye.